17-year-old serial killer sentenced to life in prison for killing more than 57 children. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The courtroom was silent, not the kind of silence that comes from respect. This was the silence of held breath, of people afraid to move, afraid to miss a single word of what was about to happen. Judge Margaret Holloway sat behind the bench, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. She looked tired, older than her 58 years. The kind of tired that comes from seeing too much, from making decisions that haunt you long after the gavel falls. In the defendant's chair sat a 17-year-old boy. His name was Ethan Crowley. He wore a navy blue suit that didn't quite fit. His mother had bought it 2 sizes too big, hoping he'd grow into it, hoping there would be a future where he'd need a suit for something other than this. His hands rested on the table in front of him, fingers interlaced. Calm, almost eerily calm. Behind him in the second row, his mother Claire sobbed quietly into a tissue. His father, Dr. Richard Crowley, sat stone-faced beside her, staring straight ahead at nothing. The gallery was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras banned but notebooks ready. Families of the victims filled the front rows, their faces a mix of grief, rage, and something that looked like relief. Relief that it was finally over. Judge Holloway cleared her throat. "Ethan Michael Crowley," she began, her voice steady but low. "You have been found guilty by a jury of your peers on 57 counts of involvement in the deaths of children over a 3-year period." A gasp rippled through the room. Ethan didn't move. His lawyer, a young public defender named Marcus Webb, closed his eyes briefly. He had tried. God knows he had tried. But the evidence had been overwhelming. The timeline, the objects found in Ethan's possession, the testimonies, it had all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. The nature of these crimes, the judge continued, her voice hardening, is beyond comprehension. The suffering inflicted, the lives destroyed, the families left shattered. Claire Crowley's sobs grew louder. Judge Holloway looked directly at Ethan. "Do you have anything to say before I pass sentence?" The room leaned forward. Ethan looked up for the first time. His eyes met the judge's. There was no defiance there, no anger, just something distant, like he was watching all of this happen to someone else. "I didn't do it," he said quietly. His voice was so soft that people in the back strained to hear. "I didn't hurt anyone." A woman in the third row stood up and screamed, "Liar! My baby is dead because of you!" The bailiff moved quickly, guiding her back down. Her husband held her as she collapsed into his arms. Judge Holloway waited for the room to settle before continuing. "Ethan Michael Crowley, I hereby sentence you to life in prison, without the possibility of parole." The gavel fell. The sound echoed like a gunshot. And in that moment, Ethan's face changed. The calm cracked. His eyes widened. His breathing quickened. His hands, which had been so still, began to tremble. "No," he whispered. "No, this isn't. I didn't." The bailiff approached. Ethan looked back at his parents, panic flooding his features for the first time. "Dad," he said, louder now, desperate. "Dad, tell them. Tell them what really happened. Please." But Dr. Crowley didn't move, didn't even look at his son. Claire reached out, but Richard pulled her. "Hand back." The bailiff cuffed Ethan's wrists. As they led him toward the side door, Ethan stopped and turned back one last time. "I didn't kill anyone," he said, voice breaking. "But I let it happen. I let it happen, and I'm sorry." The door closed behind him. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed out to file their stories. Families embraced, some in tears, others in stunned silence. The words "justice served" were whispered like a prayer. But in the back of the room, a man with a camera and a notebook stood perfectly still. His name was David Marsh. He was a documentary filmmaker who had been working on a project about gifted youth in small-town America. He had been following Ethan Crowley for months, and something about this didn't add up. David watched as Dr. Richard Crowley stood, straightened his tie, and walked out of the courtroom without a single tear, without a single word. David's pen hovered over his notebook. Then he wrote one question. How does a boy like that become a monster? Or, was he ever one at all? 3 years earlier. Pinewood Grove was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone. Population 8,400, 1 high school, 2 churches, 3 diners that all served the same meatloaf on Thursdays. It was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors at night, where kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on, where nothing bad ever happened. Until it did. But before the darkness came, there was Ethan Crowley, and by all accounts he was perfect. Ethan was the kind of student every teacher dreams of, said Mrs. Linda Pemberton, his 10th grade English teacher, in an interview recorded by David Marsh 2 months after the trial. Polite, thoughtful, always the first to volunteer. The camera footage showed her sitting in her living room, hands folded in her lap, eyes distant. He helped tutor struggling students. He organized the winter coat drive. He read to kids at the elementary school every Tuesday after class. She paused, her voice catching. I recommended him for the Governor's Youth Achievement Award. Ethan lived on Maple Street in a 2-story colonial with blue shutters and a white picket fence. His mother, Claire, taught 4th grade at Pinewood Elementary. His father, Dr. Richard Crowley, was a child psychologist with a practice downtown. They were a respected family, the kind people pointed to as an example. Richard and Claire did everything right, said their neighbor, Margaret Finch, a retired librarian. That boy had structure, discipline, love. But if you looked closer, there were cracks, small ones, easy to miss, like the day Ethan came home from school and found a dead bird in the backyard. Most kids would have been upset, called for a parent, buried it maybe. Ethan just stared at it. For a long time. His father found him there 20 minutes later, crouched in the grass, expressionless. What are you doing? Richard had asked. Watching it, Ethan said simply. Wondering what it felt like. Richard later wrote in his private notes that would eventually surface during the investigation, that he found the comment concerning but not alarming. He never followed up. Then there was the incident with Nathan Briggs. Nathan was Ethan's best friend in middle school. They did everything together, sleepovers, baseball games, science projects, until one day Nathan stopped coming around. When asked why, Nathan told his parents, Ethan scares me. How? His mother pressed. He just watches people, like he's figuring something out. And sometimes he says things that don't make sense. Like what? Nathan hesitated. He said that if you love someone enough, you'd do anything to protect them, even bad things. Nathan's parents brushed it off as teenage dramatics. But Nathan never went back to the Crowley house. At school, Ethan remained the model student. He joined the debate team, volunteered at the community center, ran the student council's anti-bullying campaign. The local newspaper ran a feature on him, Pinewood's Pride, Teen Gives Back. In the photo, Ethan stood in front of the elementary school, surrounded by smiling children. His arm was around a little girl holding a teddy bear. He was smiling too. But if you looked closely at his eyes, really looked, they seemed somewhere else entirely. David Marsh found that photo in the archives and stared at it for hours. There's something off, he muttered to himself, zooming in on Ethan's face, like he's performing. Dr. Richard Crowley was particularly proud of his son. In professional circles, Richard was known as a compassionate, brilliant clinician. He'd written 2 books on childhood trauma. He lectured at conferences. He mentored younger psychologists. And he often spoke about Ethan in glowing terms. My son is proof that with the right environment, a child can thrive, Richard told a colleague at a psychology symposium. Structure, empathy, and boundaries. That's all it takes. But at home, things were different. Claire would later tell investigators that Richard was distant with Ethan. Loving, yes, but clinical. Like he was always observing rather than connecting. He treated our son like a case study, she said quietly. I didn't see it then. But now. She trailed off. There was one moment that haunted her. Ethan was 14. He'd left his journal on the kitchen table. Claire shouldn't have read it, she knew that. But something made her open it. Most of the entries were normal. Homework complaints, thoughts about a girl he liked, plans for summer. But one entry, dated November 12th, stood out. Dad says people are fragile, that they break easy if you push the right way. I wonder if that's true. I wonder if I could fix them after, or if some things stay broken. Claire's hands had trembled as she closed the journal. She never mentioned it to Richard. She told herself it was just a kid processing his father's work. Psychologists' kids always picked up on things, but deep down she knew. She knew something wasn't right, and she did nothing. Years later, sitting in that courtroom, watching her son being sentenced to life in prison, Claire would remember that journal entry, and she would wonder if she could have stopped everything, if had just said something. David Marsh reviewed all the footage, the interviews, the photos, the timelines. Everyone described the same boy. Perfect, kind, helpful, but no one really knew him. And that's what terrified David most. Because if Ethan Crowley could fool an entire town for 17 years, what else had he been hiding? It started with Emily Sanders. She was 7 years old, blonde pigtails, gap-toothed smile, the kind of kid who said please and thank you without being reminded. On October 4th, 3 years before Ethan's trial, Emily disappeared. She'd been playing in the park. After school, her mother, Jessica Sanders, was on a bench 30 feet away, scrolling through her phone. When Jessica looked up, Emily was gone. I only looked away for a minute, Jessica told the police, her voice shaking. Maybe 2. She was right there on the swings. The search began. Immediately, volunteers combed the woods surrounding Pinewood Grove. The fire department dragged the lake. Search dogs tracked Emily's scent to the edge of the park, and then nothing. She vanished. The town was shaken but hopeful. Kids wandered off sometimes. She'd turn up. She had to. 3 days. Later, Emily's backpack was found in a drainage ditch 2 miles from the park. Inside was her lunchbox, her homework folder, and a drawing she'd made that morning in art class. It was a picture of her family holding hands under a rainbow. Emily Sanders was never seen again. The police ruled it an accident. A tragic drowning, they said, even though no body was ever recovered. The town mourned. Pinewood Elementary held a memorial. Jessica Sanders stopped leaving her house, and life, slowly, moved on. But Emily wasn't the last. 2 months later, a boy named Colin Marsh, no relation to David, went, missing after basketball practice. He was 9. His bike was found abandoned near the school, the front wheel still spinning. Then came Sarah Donnelly, age 6, vanished from her grandmother's backyard. Then twins, Jacob and Lily Renton, age 8, gone during a sleepover, one after another, over. The course of 3 years, children disappeared from Pinewood Grove at a rate that defied explanation. 57 in total. Some bodies were eventually found in the surrounding forests and lakes. Others never were. Each case was investigated. Each one was labeled differently: accidental drowning, animal attack, runaway, abduction by a non-custodial parent. The FBI was called in briefly but found no clear pattern, no single suspect, no connection between the cases. It was treated as a tragic statistical anomaly, a small town cursed by coincidence. But the parents knew better. They didn't want to see it, said Thomas Briggs, Nathan's father, in a later interview. The police, the mayor, even the FBI, nobody wanted to admit that something was hunting our children. Community meetings were held. Curfews were established. Parents stopped letting their kids walk to school alone. Fear became part of daily life. And through it all, Ethan Crowley kept volunteering at the elementary school every Tuesday. Like clockwork, he read to the younger kids, helped them with their math homework, walked them to the bus stop when their parents were late. Ethan was wonderful with the children, said Principal Diane Hopper. Patient, gentle, the kids adored him. But one mother didn't feel the same way. Her name was Rachel Torres. Her daughter Mia was in second grade. Mia came home one Tuesday and told her mother something strange. The big kid with the sad eyes was asking, "Weird questions today." "What kind of questions?" Rachel asked. "Like if I ever felt scared, and what I would do if someone I loved was in trouble." Rachel felt uneasy but brushed it off. Kids said strange things all the time. But a week later, Mia came home and said, "The sad boy was at the park today. He watched me on the swings." Rachel's stomach dropped. "Did he talk to you?" "No, he just watched. Then he left." Rachel called the school the next day. She asked that Ethan not be allowed near her daughter. The principal was understanding but dismissive. "Mrs. Torres, Ethan has been volunteering here for 2 years. He's passed every background check. He's never done anything inappropriate." "I don't care," Rachel said firmly. "Keep him away from Mia." The school complied. But Rachel wasn't the only one who noticed. A janitor named Frank Delgado told police months later, after Ethan's arrest, that he'd seen the boy near the school on several evenings when he shouldn't have been there. He'd just be standing by the fence, watching the building. I asked him once what he was doing, and he said he forgot something inside. "Did you let him in?" "No. Told him to come back. During school hours." Frank paused. "But here's the thing. I checked the security footage later out of curiosity. He'd been there before, lots of times, just standing, watching. When police reviewed the footage during the investigation, they found Ethan on camera 17 times over a 6-month period, always in the evening, always alone, always watching. Detective Laura Hernandez was assigned to the case after the 10th disappearance. She was a 20-year veteran, sharp, methodical. She didn't believe in coincidences. 57 children don't just vanish from a town this size without someone noticing a pattern, she told her partner, Officer Ben Grady. She started pulling reports, mapping locations, cross-referencing timelines, and that's when she saw it. Ethan Crowley's name appeared in connection to 3 of the missing children. He'd tutored one. He'd been photographed at a community event with another, and he'd been seen near the park the day Emily Sanders disappeared. "It's not enough for an arrest," Laura said, "but it's enough to ask questions." On a cold November morning, Detective Hernandez and Officer Grady arrived at Pinewood High School. They found Ethan in the library studying for a calculus exam. "Ethan Crowley?" Laura said, showing her badge. He looked up, calm, curious. "Yes? We'd like to ask you a few questions. It's about some of the children who've gone missing." Ethan closed his textbook. "Of course," he said. "I'll help however I can." He smiled. It was polite, respectful. But Laura noticed something. His hands resting on the table weren't shaking. Most innocent people, when approached by police, show some nervousness, some concern. Ethan showed nothing, just that smile. And in that moment, Laura Hernandez knew. This boy was hiding something. The interrogation room at Pinewood Police Department was small and windowless. A metal table, 2 chairs, a camera mounted in the corner. Ethan sat with his hands folded in front of him, perfectly still. Across from him, Detective Laura Hernandez studied his face. "Do you know why we asked you to come in today, Ethan?" she began, her tone conversational. "You said it was about the missing children," Ethan replied. "I want to help if I can." "That's good. We appreciate that." Laura leaned back in her chair. "You volunteer at Pinewood Elementary, correct?" "Yes, every Tuesday. I read to the younger kids and help with homework." "And you've been doing that for how long?" 2 years, since I was 15. Laura nodded, jotting notes on a yellow pad. "Did you know Emily Sanders?" Ethan's expression didn't change. "I knew who she was. I didn't work with her directly, but I saw her around the school." "What about Colin Marsh?" "Same, I knew his face, but we never spoke." "Sarah Donnelly?" A pause, brief, almost imperceptible. "I tutored her in reading. Ethan said quietly. She was struggling with phonics. Sweet kid. Laura's pen stopped moving. When was the last time you saw Sarah? The Tuesday before she disappeared. We read The Very Hungry Caterpillar together. She loved that book. And you didn't see her after that? No. Laura leaned forward slightly. Ethan, were you at Harmon Park on October 4th, the day Emily Sanders went missing? For the first time, Ethan hesitated. I'm not sure. I go to that park sometimes to think. To think? Yeah, it's quiet. I like to walk there after school. Do you remember if you were there that specific day? Ethan looked down at his hands. I might have been. I don't keep track. Laura exchanged a glance with Officer Grady, who stood by the door. Ethan, she said carefully, a witness placed you near the swings that afternoon, around the time Emily was last seen. Ethan's jaw tightened, just slightly. I don't remember seeing her. But you were there. Maybe. I don't know. The room fell silent. Laura. Let the silence stretch. It was an old technique. Most people couldn't stand it. They'd fill the gap, say too much. But Ethan just sat there, waiting. Finally, Laura spoke again. We're going to need to search your belongings, your locker, your backpack, with your permission, of course. Ethan nodded immediately. Of course, I have nothing to hide. An hour later, Officer Grady returned from Pinewood High School carrying Ethan's backpack in an evidence bag. Laura opened it carefully, laying each item on the table. Textbooks, notebooks, pens, a water bottle. And then, at the very bottom, wrapped in a plastic sandwich bag, a small pink hair clip. Laura held it up. Do you recognize this, Ethan? He stared at it, his face unreadable. No. It was in your backpack. I've never seen it before. Laura placed a photograph on the table. It showed Emily Sanders on the day she disappeared, smiling at the camera. In her hair was a pink hair clip, the same one. Ethan's breathing quickened. I don't know how that got there, he said, voice rising slightly. I've never seen that before. Someone must have put it in my bag. Who would do that? I don't know. Laura watched him carefully. The calm was cracking, just a little. Ethan, I'm going to be straight with you. This doesn't look good. We have you near the park the day Emily disappeared. We have her hair clip in your backpack, and you've had contact with at least 3 other missing children. I didn't hurt anyone, Ethan said, his voice trembling now. I didn't, I wouldn't. Then help us understand. How did that hair clip end up in your bag? Ethan looked at the camera in the corner, then at the door, then back at Laura. His lips parted as if to speak, but then he stopped, and something in his expression changed. The panic faded. The fear smoothed out. He looked directly at Laura and said very calmly, I want a lawyer. The case moved quickly after that. A search warrant was executed on the Crowley home. In Ethan's bedroom, investigators found a shoebox hidden under his bed. Inside were more items. A child's mitten. A library card with someone else's name. A keychain shaped like a dinosaur. Each item was traced back to one of the missing children, but there was no blood, no weapons, no physical evidence of violence. Just objects, as if he'd been collecting them. Dr. Richard Crowley was interviewed. Separately. Have you noticed any unusual behavior from your son? Detective Hernandez asked. Richard sat stiffly in his chair, hands clasped. Ethan has always been a sensitive child. Introspective, but never violent. Has he ever been diagnosed with any psychological conditions? Richard paused. I treated him for mild dissociative tendencies when he was younger. Nothing severe. Dissociative tendencies? Difficulty connecting emotionally. A sense of detachment from his surroundings. It's not uncommon in gifted children. Did you document this treatment? Some of it. Patient. Confidentiality applies, even between father and son. Laura didn't push, not yet, but she made a note. Father is hiding something. The town erupted when news of Ethan's arrest broke. Parents who had trusted him with their children felt betrayed. Neighbors who had smiled at him on the street now locked their doors. The local news ran the story on a loop. Teen volunteer arrested in connection to missing children case. Ethan's face was plastered on every screen, and in the court of public opinion, he was already guilty. But David Marsh, watching from his cramped apartment with files spread across his desk, saw something different. He looked at the evidence list, the hair clip, the mitten, the keychain. These aren't trophies, he muttered to himself. Trophies are personal, hidden, cherished. He circled a line in his notes. Items were easy to find, almost like they were meant to be found. David leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. What if, he said aloud, testing the thought, what if Ethan wanted to get caught? The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning. Ethan was in third period chemistry when two uniformed officers walked into the classroom. Everyone stopped. Mr. Feldman, the teacher, looked up from the periodic table he'd been explaining. Can I help you? We need to speak with Ethan Crowley, one of the officers said. All eyes turned to Ethan. He sat frozen at his lab table, a beaker of blue liquid in front of him. Slowly, he stood. Am I in trouble? He asked quietly. Just come with us, son. The hallway felt impossibly long. Students pressed against classroom windows, watching as Ethan was led toward the front entrance. Whispers followed him like a shadow. Outside, a police cruiser waited. Detective Hernandez stood beside it, arms crossed. Ethan Crowley, she said formally. You're under arrest in connection with the disappearances of multiple children in Pinewood Grove. You have the right to remain silent. The words blurred together. Ethan's hands were cuffed behind his back. The metal felt cold against his wrists. As they guided him into the car, he looked back at the school one last time. His classmates stared. Some looked shocked. Others looked afraid. One girl, Emma Sinclair, who'd had a crush on him since freshman year, was crying. The car door closed, and Ethan Crowley's perfect life ended. By noon, every news station, news in the state was running the story. Model student arrested in child disappearance case. Pinewood volunteer linked to 57 missing children. The boy next door, how a teen fooled an entire town. Claire Crowley collapsed when she heard. She was in her classroom, teaching fractions to her fourth graders when the principal appeared at the door. Claire, we need to talk. Now. The look on his face told her everything. She didn't remember the drive to the police station, didn't remember Richard meeting her there, his face pale and rigid. All she remembered was seeing Ethan through the glass window of the interrogation room. He looked so small. This is a mistake, Claire whispered. He couldn't. But Richard said nothing. He just stared at his son with an expression Claire couldn't read. That evening, the Crowley house was surrounded. News vans lined the street. Reporters knocked on the door. Cameras flashed through the windows. Neighbors who had known the family for years stood on their lawns, arms crossed, watching. Margaret Finch, who had once brought the Crowleys casseroles, now refused to make eye contact. I always knew something was off about that boy, she told a reporter, despite having said the exact opposite just weeks earlier. Inside, Claire sat in the dark living room, clutching a photo of Ethan from his 10th birthday. He was blowing out candles, smiling, surrounded by friends. Where did I go wrong? She whispered. Richard stood by the window, watching the chaos outside. We did nothing wrong, he said flatly. This is who he is. Claire looked up at him, shocked. How can you say that? He's our son. He's a suspect in 57 disappearances, Claire. The evidence is circumstantial. He's being framed. He has to be. Richard turned to face her. Wake up, he said, his voice cold. Our son is not who you think he is. Claire's hands trembled. You're his father. How can you turn on him so quickly? Richard didn't answer. He just walked upstairs and closed the door to his study. Across town, in a cramped coffee shop, David Marsh sat with his laptop open. He'd been following the case obsessively since the trial announcement months ago. But now, with Ethan's arrest, Things were moving faster. David had started his documentary project on gifted youth as a passion piece. He'd interviewed Ethan twice before the arrest. Casual conversations about academics, future goals, philosophy. Ethan had been articulate, thoughtful, almost too thoughtful. David replayed the footage now. In one clip, Ethan said something that stuck with him. "I think people only see what they want to see. If you act a certain way long enough, they stop looking deeper." David had thought it was profound at the time. Now it felt like a confession, but something didn't sit right. David pulled up the evidence list leaked to the press. The items found in Ethan's backpack and bedroom. A hair clip, a mitten, a keychain. "Why would someone keep these?" David muttered. "Why not destroy them?" He opened a new document and typed, questions. 1. Why were the items so easy to find? 2. Why didn't Ethan run when questioned? 3. Why did he say, "I didn't do it, but I let it happen"? David sat back, tapping his pen against the table. That phrase haunted him. "I let it happen." Not "I did it," not "I'm innocent," "I let it happen." "What does that mean?" David whispered. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "If you want the truth, stop looking at the boy. Start looking at who he's protecting." David stared at the message. His heart pounded. He hit reply. "Who is this?" No response. The interrogations continued for weeks. Ethan sat across from Detective Hernandez day after day, his lawyer beside him saying nothing. Marcus Webb, the public defender, was young and overworked. He did his best, but the evidence was damning. "They found those items in your possession, Ethan," Marcus said during a private meeting. "We need an explanation. Something, anything." Ethan stared at the table. "I can't. Can't or won't. Does it matter?" Marcus slammed his folder shut. "Yes, it matters. They're going to crucify you if you don't give me something to work with." Ethan finally looked up. "Then let them." Marcus froze. "What?" "Let them crucify me. It's better this way." "Better for who?" Ethan didn't answer. Meanwhile, Detective Hernandez was hitting walls. The items linked Ethan to the victims, but there was no physical evidence of violence, no DNA, no blood, no murder weapons, just objects. "It doesn't make sense," Laura told Officer Grady over coffee. "Serial offenders don't just collect trinkets, they escalate. There should be more." "Maybe he hid it better. Or maybe..." Laura trailed off. "Maybe, what?" She shook her head. "I don't know yet." Then the first crack appeared. A forensic analyst named Dr. Peter Calloway was reviewing the evidence when he noticed something odd about the timestamps. The hair clip found in Ethan's backpack had been photographed and logged into evidence, but the metadata on the photo showed it had been taken before the search warrant was executed. "That's impossible," Dr. Calloway muttered. He checked again. The photo was dated 3 days before the official search. He brought it to Detective Hernandez immediately. "Someone photographed this evidence before..." "We found it," he said. Laura's face went pale. "Who had access?" "Only our team and..." He hesitated. "The evidence locker at the station." Laura's mind raced. "Pull the logs. Everyone who entered that room in the last month." The logs showed 5 names. 4 were expected. Detectives and evidence. Techs. The 5th name made Laura's blood run cold. Officer Ben Grady, her partner. Claire Crowley stopped going to work. She couldn't face the other teachers, couldn't look the parents in the eye. She spent her days in Ethan's bedroom, surrounded by his things. Trophies from debate team. Science. Fair ribbons. Photos of him smiling at birthday parties. "Where did I lose you?" she whispered to the empty room. Richard, meanwhile, buried himself in his practice. He saw patients, wrote reports, lectured at conferences. He never mentioned his son. Colleagues whispered. Some reached out with sympathy. Others avoided him entirely. One day, a fellow psychologist named Dr. Alan Wexler stopped by Richard's office. Alan was older, silver-haired, with kind eyes and a grandfatherly demeanor. He'd been Richard's mentor for years. "How are you holding up?" Alan asked gently. Richard didn't look up from his desk. I'm fine. Richard, your son was just arrested for… I know what he was arrested for. Alan sat down across from him. Have you spoken to him? No. Don't you think you should? Richard's jaw tightened. What would I say? Alan leaned forward. You could ask him what happened. You could listen. I already know what happened. Do you? Richard finally looked up, his eyes hard. My son kept trophies from missing children, Alan. The evidence is clear. Evidence can be misleading. Not this time. Alan studied him carefully. You diagnosed Ethan yourself, didn't you? Years ago. Richard said nothing. What did you find? Nothing relevant. Richard, this conversation is over. Alan stood slowly. I hope you know what you're doing. After he left, Richard opened a locked drawer in his desk. Inside was a file labeled Ethan Crowley, patient notes. Confidential. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he closed the drawer without opening the file. Back at the police station, Laura Hernandez confronted Officer Grady. Why were you in the evidence locker 3 days before we executed the search warrant on Ethan Crowley? She asked, her voice tight. Ben looked genuinely confused. What are you talking about? The logs show you accessed the room, the same room where the evidence from Ethan's case was later stored. Laura, that's impossible. I wasn't even assigned to the case yet. Then why does your ID show up? Ben's face went pale. I don't know. Someone must have used my card. Who? I have no idea. I keep it clipped to my belt. I never let it out of my sight. Laura wanted to believe him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. That night, David Marsh received another anonymous text. Check Richard Crowley's patient files. The answer is there. David stared at the message. Patient files were confidential, protected, impossible to access without a court order. But David had sources, and he was starting to believe that the only way to find the truth was to break the rules. Trial preparation began. The prosecution built their case methodically. Timelines, evidence photos, witness statements. Ethan's name was now synonymous with evil in Pinewood Grove, but cracks were forming. A man named Leonard Hatch came forward claiming he had information about the disappearances. Leonard was a former maintenance worker at Pinewood Elementary. He'd been fired 6 months before Ethan's arrest for erratic behavior. He told police he'd seen someone else near the school on the nights children went missing. It wasn't the Crowley boy, Leonard insisted during his interview. It was someone older, taller. I saw him by the back gate twice. Can you describe him? Detective Hernandez asked. Leonard squinted, trying to remember. Average height, dark coat. I couldn't see his face, but I remember thinking it was odd because the school was closed. Did you report this at the time? Leonard shifted uncomfortably. No, I had my own problems, didn't want to get involved. Laura made notes but remained skeptical. Why come forward now? Because that kid's going down for something I don't think he did, and I can't live with that. Leonard was scheduled to testify, but 3 days before his deposition, he vanished. His apartment was empty, his phone disconnected, his car gone. It was as if he'd never existed. Laura put out a missing persons report, but Leonard Hatch was never found. Convenient, Officer Grady muttered. Too convenient, Laura replied. Meanwhile, another name surfaced in the investigation. A man named Thomas Ridley. Thomas worked for the county's Child Protective Services. He had access to records on every family in Pinewood Grove, including the families of the missing children. An anonymous tip, sent to Laura's desk in a plain envelope, suggested Thomas had been unusually interested in cases involving vulnerable children. Laura pulled his employment records. Thomas had worked for CPS for 12 years. Clean background, no complaints. But when she cross-referenced his work schedule with the disappearances, a pattern emerged. Thomas had conducted home visits to the families of 11 missing children in the months before they vanished. 11 out of 57. Laura brought him in for questioning. Thomas was calm, professional, almost bored. I visit hundreds of families every year, he said. It's my job. But you visited these specific families right before their children disappeared. Coincidence. Quite a coincidence. Thomas leaned back in his chair. Are you accusing me of something, Detective? Laura held his gaze. Should I be? Thomas smiled faintly. I think you're desperate. You've got a kid in custody, evidence that points to him, and now you're grasping at straws because something doesn't feel right. He stood. Am I under arrest? No. Then we're done here. He walked out. Laura watched him go, her gut screaming that he was hiding something. But without evidence, her hands were doodle. That night, David Marsh sat in his car outside Dr. Richard Crowley's office. He'd been staking it out for 3 days, waiting for the right moment. Finally, just after midnight, the lights went out. Richard's car pulled away. David waited 10 minutes. Then he approached the back door with a lockpick kit he'd bought online. His hands shook as he worked the lock. This is breaking and entering, a voice in his head warned. You could go to jail. But another voice, louder, pushed him forward. Ethan said he let it happen. What if he's protecting someone? The lock clicked. David slipped. Inside, Richard's office was immaculate. Bookshelves lined the walls. A mahogany desk sat in the center. David moved quickly, searching drawers, filing cabinets. Then he found it. A locked drawer in the desk. He pried it open with a screwdriver. Inside was a single file. Ethan Crowley, patient. Notes, confidential. David's heart pounded as he opened it. The first page was a diagnostic report from when Ethan was 11 years old. But as David read further, his blood ran cold. The notes weren't about Ethan. They were about someone else entirely. The courtroom was packed. Families of the victims filled the front rows, their faces etched with grief and rage. News cameras lined the back wall, forbidden from filming, but present nonetheless. Ethan sat at the defense table in a suit that didn't fit, his hands folded, his expression blank. Judge Margaret Halloway entered, and everyone rose. The state versus Ethan Michael Crowley, she announced. Prosecution, you may begin. District Attorney Sharon Vance stood. She was sharp, methodical, a woman who didn't lose cases. Your Honor, members of the jury, she began, her voice steady and clear. Over the course of 3 years, 57 children vanished from Pinewood Grove. 57 families were destroyed. And the evidence will show that the defendant, Ethan Crowley, is responsible. She paused, letting the weight of the number settle. The prosecution will present physical evidence linking Mr. Crowley to multiple victims. We will show a pattern of behavior. We will demonstrate opportunity. And we will prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that this young man is guilty. Sharon walked to the evidence table and held up a plastic bag containing the pink hair clip. This belonged to Emily Sanders. It was found in the defendant's backpack. She held up another bag. This mitten belonged to Sarah Donnelly, found in his bedroom. One by one, she displayed the items. The jury watched, their faces growing darker with each piece. Marcus Webb, the defense attorney, looked pale. When it was his turn to give an opening statement, he stood slowly. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice less confident than Sharon's. My client is 17 years old, a student, a volunteer, and yes, items were found in his possession, but possession does not equal guilt. He glanced at Ethan, who stared straight ahead. The evidence is circumstantial. There is no DNA, no witnesses, no confession. The prosecution will ask you to condemn a boy based on objects that could have been planted. Sharon smirked slightly. Marcus continued. I ask you to keep an open mind, to question what you're being told, because once you convict an innocent person, that injustice can never be undone. He sat down. The trial moved quickly. Witness after witness took the stand. Jessica Sanders, Emily's mother, sobbed as she described the day her daughter disappeared. I only looked away for a moment, she whispered. Just a moment. Sharon asked gently, Did you know the defendant? Yes, he volunteered at the elementary school. My daughter liked him. Did you ever see him near Emily? Jessica hesitated. Once, at the park, a few weeks before she was gone. The jury took notes. Next came Thomas Briggs, Nathan's father. My son was friends with Ethan, he said. Until he wasn't. Why did the friendship end? Sharon asked. Nathan said Ethan scared him, that he said strange things. What kind of things? That sometimes you have to hurt people to protect them. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Marcus objected. Hearsay, Your Honor. Sustained, Judge Holloway said. The jury will disregard. But the damage was done. The faces of the jurors had already changed. Then came the forensic expert, Dr. Helen Cross. She testified about the items found in Ethan's possession, confirming they belonged to the victims. But during cross-examination, Marcus asked a critical question. Dr. Cross, were any of these items tested for fingerprints? She hesitated. Yes. And whose fingerprints were found? The defendant's, and several unknowns. Unknowns? Yes, unidentified prints on multiple items. Multiple. Marcus turned to the jury. So someone else touched these objects? Objection, Sharon said sharply. Speculation. Sustained. But Marcus had planted the seed. As the trial progressed, Ethan never spoke, never reacted. He sat perfectly still day after day as his life was dissected. Claire attended every session, sitting in the back, crying quietly. Richard came once. He sat for 20 minutes watching his son. Then he left, and never returned. On the 8th day of testimony, David Marsh slipped into the courtroom. He'd spent the last week analyzing the file he'd stolen from Richard's office. What he'd found was explosive. But he needed confirmation. He needed to find someone who could verify what he suspected. And sitting 3 rows ahead of him, taking notes, was someone unexpected. Dr. Alan Wexler, Richard's mentor. The man who'd visited Richard's office weeks earlier. David's pulse quickened. Why was Alan Wexler so interested in this trial? On the 10th day of the trial, the prosecution called their most damaging witness, a woman named Carol Jensen. Carol had been Ethan's guidance counselor at Pinewood High. She'd known him for 3 years. She took the stand nervously, her hands trembling as she was sworn in. Sharon Vance approached gently. Ms. Jensen, how would you describe your relationship with the defendant? Professional, supportive. He came to my office regularly to talk about college applications. Did he ever discuss anything unusual? Carol hesitated. Yes, once. The courtroom leaned forward. It was about 6 months before his arrest. Ethan came to my office visibly upset. He said he needed to tell me something. What did he say? Carol's voice dropped to a whisper. He said, "What if you knew something terrible was happening? But telling someone would destroy everything? Would you stay silent?" Murmurs erupted. Judge Holloway gavelled for silence. Sharon continued. "And what did you tell him?" I asked what he was talking about. He just shook his head and said, "Never mind. Forget I said anything." Did you report this? Conversation? No, I thought he was being philosophical. Ethan often talked in abstracts. Sharon nodded. But looking back now, do you believe he was confessing? Marcus shot to his feet. Objection. Calls for speculation. Sustained. But again, the jury had heard enough. Marcus cross-examined. Weakly, but Carol's testimony had landed. After court adjourned, David followed Dr. Alan Wexler into the parking lot. "Dr. Wexler," he called out. The older man turned, surprised. "Can I help you?" "I'm David Marsh, documentary filmmaker. I'd like to ask you about Richard Crowley." Alan's expression hardened. "I have nothing to say. Even if it could help Ethan?" Alan paused, his hand on his car door. "That boy is beyond help." "Is he? Or is someone else?" Alan's eyes narrowed. "What are you implying?" David stepped closer. "I know about the file. The patient notes, they weren't about Ethan." Alan's face went pale. "You broke into Richard's office?" I did what I had to do. For a long moment, Alan said nothing. Then quietly, "You don't know what you're dealing with. Then tell me." Alan looked around, then leaned in. "Richard didn't write those notes. I did." David's heart pounded. "You wrote the notes?" Alan glanced around the parking lot nervously. "Not here. Meet me at Riverside Park, 1 hour. Come alone." Before David could respond, Alan got in his car and drove away. David stood frozen, his mind racing. An hour later, he sat on a bench overlooking the river. The park was empty. The sun was setting. Alan appeared from the tree line, walking slowly. He sat down beside David, staring out at the water. "What I'm about to tell you stays between us," Alan said quietly. "If this gets out, people will die." David pulled out his phone to record. "No," Alan said sharply. "No. Recordings. You listen. You remember. That's all." David reluctantly put the phone away. Alan took a deep breath. "Richard came to me 15 years ago. He was treating a young patient, a boy. Brilliant, charming. But something was wrong." "What kind of wrong?" "The boy had no empathy, no emotional connection. He manipulated everyone around him effortlessly." David's stomach tightened. Richard documented everything, the sessions, the diagnosis, the treatment attempts. What was the diagnosis? Alan hesitated. Severe antisocial personality disorder. Psychopathy, at age 7. David felt cold. But the notes in Richard's office, they had Ethan's name on them. Alan nodded slowly. Because Richard changed the patient's name. Years later, after the disappearances started. Why? Alan turned to face him. Because the original patient wasn't Ethan. David's breath caught. Then who was it? Alan's voice dropped to a whisper. Someone powerful, someone untouchable. Someone who's been using Ethan as a shield since the beginning. Who? Alan stood. I've said too much already. Wait. The town doesn't want the truth, Mr. Marsh. They want a monster they can understand. A teenage boy fits that narrative. But Ethan is innocent. Alan looked at him with sad eyes. Innocent of murder, yes, but complicit in covering it up. And in the eyes of the law, that's enough. He started to walk away. Dr. Wexler, David called. Who is it? Who's really responsible? Alan stopped, but didn't turn around. Follow the money, follow the power, follow the people who had everything to lose. Then he disappeared into the shadows. David sat alone, his hands shaking. He pulled out his notebook and wrote frantically. Someone powerful, someone untouchable, someone who used Ethan as a shield. He circled one name that had appeared repeatedly in his research, a name connected to the school, to the town council, to Child Protective Services, a name no one had questioned. Thomas Ridley. David spent the next 3 days digging into Thomas Ridley's background. On the surface, Ridley was clean, respected, a 12-year veteran of Child Protective Services with commendations and awards. But David found cracks, small ones at first. Ridley had been investigated twice for boundary violations with clients. Both cases were dismissed, records sealed. He'd been sued by a family, claiming he manipulated custody evaluations, settled out of court. No admission of guilt. And most damning, Ridley had access to detailed files on every missing child's family. He knew their routines, their vulnerabilities, their schedules. David cross-referenced dates. Ridley had conducted home visits to 11 families in the months before their children disappeared. But there was more. Ridley's supervisor at CPS was a woman named Margaret Stills. David called her under the guise of a researcher working on child welfare policy. Thomas Ridley, Margaret said when asked. Brilliant. Caseworker, one of our best. Were there ever concerns about his methods? A pause. Why do you ask? Just thorough research. Margaret's tone cooled. Thomas was intense. He believed in protecting children at any cost. Sometimes that meant bending rules. What kind of rules? I can't discuss. Specifics. Did he ever have inappropriate contact with children? Silence. Then, carefully, there were whispers. Nothing concrete. Nothing we could prove. But you suspected something. I suspected he had boundary issues. That's all I can say. David thanked her and hung up. His next call was to the county records office. He requested financial disclosures for anyone connected to Pinewood's child welfare programs. What he found made his blood run cold. Thomas Ridley had received 3 large payments over the past 4 years from a shell company called Horizon Child Advocacy. Each payment, $50,000. Total, $150,000. David traced the company. It was registered to a law firm in the state capital. The firm's senior partner, Dr. Alan Wexler's brother-in-law. David sat back, his mind reeling. This wasn't just about one man. This was a network that had been operating for years, hidden beneath the surface of a quiet town, and Ethan Crowley had stumbled into the middle of it. But why would Ethan protect them? David pulled out the trial transcripts and found Ethan's statement from the day of his arrest. I didn't do it, but I let it happen. David whispered aloud, testing the theory. What if Ethan knew what was happening, but was threatened into silence? His phone buzzed. An email from an anonymous sender. Subject, you're getting close. The message contained a single attachment, a scanned document. David opened it. It was a psychological evaluation. Dated 12 years ago. The patient's name had been redacted, but the signature at the bottom was clear. Dr. Richard Crowley and Dr. Alan Wexler. The diagnosis, severe antisocial personality disorder. Patient exhibits manipulative behavior, lack of empathy, and predatory patterns. Recommend intensive treatment and monitoring. Patient poses significant risk to vulnerable populations. At the bottom, handwritten in red ink, patient shows particular interest in children. Intervention critical. David's hands shook. This evaluation wasn't about Ethan. It was about someone else, someone who had been flagged as dangerous over a decade ago, someone who was never stopped, someone who was still free. The trial entered its final week. The prosecution rested their case with overwhelming evidence, the items, the testimonies, the timeline. Marcus Webb called only 2 witnesses for the defense. A character witness who described Ethan as kind and gentle, and a psychologist who testified that the evidence was consistent with someone being coerced, not someone acting alone. But it wasn't enough. Sharon Vance's closing argument was devastating. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence is clear. Ethan Crowley had access, he had opportunity, and he had the items belonging to these innocent children in his possession. She gestured to the photos of the victims displayed on a board. 57 faces, 57 lives, 57 families destroyed, and the person responsible sits right there. She pointed at Ethan. Don't let him hide behind excuses. Don't let him claim he was manipulated. He made choices, and those choices took children from this world. The jury listened, stone-faced. Marcus stood for his closing argument. He looked tired, defeated. You've heard the prosecution paint. My client is a monster, he began, but I ask you to consider what's missing. There's no physical evidence of violence, no DNA, no murder weapon, no confession. He paused. All we have are objects. Objects that could have been planted. Objects that someone else touched, as the forensic evidence showed. He looked at the jury desperately. Ethan Crowley is 17 years old. He's scared, and he's innocent. But even as he said it, Marcus knew. He could see it in their eyes. They'd already decided. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood. On all 57 counts, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. Families sobbed, some in relief, others in anguish. Claire Crowley screamed and collapsed. Ethan sat perfectly still. His face was blank, empty. Judge Holloway banged her gavel. Order! Order in the court! When the room finally quieted, she looked at Ethan. Mr. Crowley, You have been found guilty of involvement in the deaths of 57 children. Do you have anything to say before I pass sentence? Ethan stood slowly. For the first time in weeks, he spoke. I didn't kill anyone, he said, his voice cracking. But I knew. I knew and I stayed silent, and I'm sorry. Murmurs rippled through the room. Your Honor, Ethan continued, tears streaming down his face. I was protecting someone who… Enough, Judge Holloway interrupted. Save it for your appeal. She opened her sentencing file. Ethan, Michael Crowley, I hereby sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel fell. Claire was led out, sobbing uncontrollably. Richard Crowley sat in the back row, expressionless. As the bailiff led Ethan away, he turned one last time. His eyes found his father. And he mouthed 2 words, I'm sorry. Richard looked away. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Sharon Vance gave a statement. Justice has been served. Pinewood Grove can finally begin to heal. The families nodded in agreement. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief. The monster had been caught. The case was closed. But in the back of the crowd, David Marsh stood with his camera filming everything. He looked down at his notebook, where he'd written one name in red ink, Thomas Ridley. The trial was over. But David's investigation had just begun, and he knew one thing for certain. The wrong person was behind bars. 6 months after the verdict, Pinewood Grove tried to move on. Memorials were erected. Counseling services expanded. The town held a candlelight vigil, but the wounds remained. Ethan Crowley became a name parents used to scare their children into obedience. Behave, or you'll end up like that Crowley boy. Claire moved out of state. She couldn't bear the stares, the whispers, the hate mail. Richard continued his practice, though many clients left. He stopped giving lectures, stopped publishing. He became a ghost in his own life. David Marsh, meanwhile, refused to let it go. He'd been working in secret, compiling evidence, conducting interviews, following every lead. And finally, he found it. A former CPS employee named Sandra Meeks agreed to meet him at a diner 2 towns over. She looked nervous, constantly glancing at the door. I shouldn't be here, she said. But you came, David replied. Why? Sandra took a shaky breath. Because I know Thomas Ridley is dirty, and I know what he did. David's heart raced. Tell me. Sandra pulled out a folder. 3 years ago, I noticed irregularities in Ridley's case files, home visits that weren't logged, reports that contradicted his notes, families that suddenly withdrew complaints. Did you report it? I tried. My supervisor buried it, said I was being paranoid. She slid the folder across the table. Then I found these. David opened it. Inside were copies of financial records, wire transfers, email correspondence, all linking Thomas Ridley to Horizon Child Advocacy, the shell company David had discovered. But there was more. Ridley wasn't working alone, Sandra said. He had help, someone with authority, someone who could make evidence disappear. Who? Sandra hesitated. I don't have proof, but I have a name. David waited. Dr. Alan Wexler. David's blood ran cold. Wexler was on the board of Horizon. He helped funnel money. He covered for Ridley when questions were raised. Why? Sandra's eyes filled with tears. Because Ridley had something on him, something from years ago. A patient, a child. David leaned forward. What patient? I don't know. The records were sealed, but Wexler treated him, diagnosed him, and then buried the file. David's mind raced. The evaluation he'd found, the redacted name, it all connected. And Ethan? David asked. Where does he fit? Sandra looked down. Ethan was Dr. Richard Crowley's son. Richard was Wexler's protege. When the disappearances started, they needed someone to take the fall. So they framed him. Not exactly. Ethan knew. He'd figured it out somehow. But instead of going to the police, he stayed silent. Sandra nodded. Because they threatened him, or his family, or both. David felt sick. Do you have proof of any of this? Sandra pulled out a flash drive. Emails, financial records, recorded phone calls, everything you need. She handed it to him. But be careful. These people are dangerous. They've already made one boy disappear into prison. They won't hesitate to do worse to you. David pocketed the drive. Why are you helping me? Sandra's voice broke. Because my niece was one of the 57. David's chest tightened. I'm sorry. Sandra wiped her eyes. Just make sure the truth comes out. That's all I ask. That night, David sat in his apartment reviewing the files. The evidence was damning, but he needed one more piece. He needed a confession. He picked up his phone and dialed. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. Hello? Dr. Crowley, David said. We talk about your son and about what you did to him. There was a long silence. Then, quietly, I'll meet you, but come alone. David met Richard Crowley at an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. It was past midnight. The air was cold, silent. Richard stood in the shadows, hands in his coat. Pockets. You've been digging, Richard said flatly. I have. And what did you find? David stepped closer. I found that your son didn't kill anyone. I found that Thomas Ridley did. And I found that you and Alan Wexler helped cover it up. Richard's expression didn't change. You don't understand. Then explain it to me. Richard exhaled slowly. 15 years ago, Alan and I treated a boy, 7 years old, charming, intelligent, and completely devoid of empathy. Thomas Ridley's son, David said. Richard's eyes widened slightly. You know, I figured it out. Ridley's son was the patient in the redacted file. You and Wexler diagnosed him as a psychopath. Richard nodded. We recommended immediate intervention, institutionalization, but Ridley refused. He had connections, power. He threatened to destroy us if we reported it. So you stayed silent. We had no choice. David's voice rose. You had every choice. You let a dangerous child go untreated and then he started killing. Richard interrupted, his voice hollow. By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late. Ridley's son was untouchable. His father made sure of it. So you framed Ethan instead. Richard's face crumpled. Not framed Ethan, he found out. He discovered what Ridley's son was doing, and he came to me. David's stomach turned. What did you tell him? Richard's voice broke. I told him to stay quiet. I told him that if he spoke, Ridley would kill him, kill mother, kill me. So Ethan stayed silent. He watched it happen. He collected evidence, thinking one day he could use it. But you planted that evidence in his room. Richard nodded, tears streaming. Wexler and we had to protect ourselves. We couldn't let the truth come out. So we made Ethan the villain. You sacrificed your own son. I saved his life, Richard shouted. If Ridley knew Ethan was going to expose him, he would have killed him. This way, Ethan lives. He rots in prison, but he lives. David stared at him in disgust. And Ridley's son? Richard looked away. He's still out. There, living under a new identity. Wexler arranged it, Ridley paid for it. Where? I don't know. And even if I did, I wouldn't tell you. These people don't forgive. They don't forget. David pulled out his phone. I'm going to the FBI with everything. The recordings, the financial records, all. Fit. Richard grabbed his arm. They won't believe you. Ridley has friends in high places, judges, prosecutors, politicians. You'll be discredited before you even start. Then I'll go to the media. And Ethan will be killed in prison before the story breaks. David froze. You're bluffing. Richard's face was grim. Ridley has people inside, guards, inmates. If this goes public, Ethan is dead within 48 hours. David felt the weight of it crushing him. So what? We just let them win? Richard released his arm. We let Ethan survive. That's all we can do. David backed away, shaking his head. You're a coward. I'm a father, Richard whispered. David left the warehouse. He sat in his car, the flash drive in his hand. He thought about Ethan, about the 57 families, about justice, and he thought about Sandra's niece. David uploaded the files to an encrypted server. He sent copies to 3 investigative journalists he trusted. He sent one to the FBI, and he sent one to Ethan's lawyer. Then he released the documentary. It went viral within hours. The evidence was undeniable. The cover-up exposed, but Ridley disappeared before he could be arrested. Wexler was found dead 2 days later. Apparent suicide. The town erupted in chaos, investigations launched, arrests made. But Ethan Crowley remained in prison. His conviction stood. Complicity, they called it. The system had its monster. And the truth didn't change that. David visited Ethan one last time. Through the glass, Ethan looked older, tired. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly, "for trying. I'm sorry I couldn't get you out." Ethan shook his head. "I'm alive. That's more than I expected." David's voice cracked. "You deserved better." Ethan smiled sadly. "In a world that prefers comfortable, the truth is just another crime." The line went dead. David walked out into the daylight. The case was closed. But justice? Justice never came.